Perfect. So thank you very much, Hiro, for your for introducing me with such kind words, for inviting me here to this to give this talk. It's a great pleasure. I'm very excited to present some of my work, or the work that I've done with other people at ATR and with collaborators in the US and in the UK. So some of this work I will present today is a little bit older, was published last week and last year, and another part of the talk will be much more recent work, which was published this week. But overall, the theme really is sort of how higher cognitive resources can foster efficient learning now. So this all has to do really with decisions in the end. We make decisions. The thing this talk really is about choices and how we learn to make choices. And if you think about it, this is sort of really important because so now think, like, imagine this kind of scenario here. You're walking in this forest and you're trying to, so you're hiking there, you're trying to reach your campsite and your tent. So this kind of environment, is almost like any kind of real day situation, will involve very high dimensional space of representations. You have all visual features, you might have other modalities. And if you think of any sort of algorithm that either has to learn or just sort of deploy a policy in this extremely high dimensional space, then this becomes a little bit probably difficult. And so ideally we would want to operate on this sort of summarized representation, or we can call abstractions in a way. But how the brain operates this transformation, so how the brain is able to recast sort of complex, very complex problems into much simplified ones that can be learned efficiently, remains kind of so there's a lot of research, but there's still a lot of unknowns in that. And I think this problem becomes particularly intriguing when we think about learning through reinforcement, so by carrot or by stick. It's a very long tradition of research in reinforcement learning, from early animal work to then more artificial learning. But the basic idea is that you have an agent that is acting in an environment and has some internal states, can sample observation from the environment, and based on the actions, on the behavior that this agent takes, will obtain either some rewards, some punishments, or nothing at all. And based on that, the agent can update their policies and therefore their behavior and learn. But again, if we go back to the initial example I gave you here, if the number of states that one can sample or can take from this kind of environment here is enormous, is way too high. And if you think of a second aspect of it, is that you might want to only focus on some part of this space, depending on your goals. And so essentially the brain or any kind of learning agent will have a very hard time if it has really to operate on this very high dimensional space. And so, and especially when the data is sparse, training is limited, dimensions are huge, we end up in this kind of problem, which is called the curse-of-dimensionality. Too many dimensions, and it's basically impossible to reach, to converge to any meaningful solution. Now, modern artificial intelligence is actually pretty good at dealing with this, and this really stems from a sort of from from different aspects that come together, which is the new development of very complex, very deep new artificial neural networks, availability of extremely large data sets, and of course, very powerful, very fast computing. So when those kind of conditions are met, then even when, let's say, the dimensionality of the problem is very high, the agent, let's say the network could learn. But oftentimes this is not the case, especially if we think in terms of the brain. We might not have that many samples, or we might not be able to let's say to have as many learning steps as a deep neural network. So there must be some other solution that has that biology basically or nature has found. And if we think of the brain, we might think, okay, of course we might have a sparseness prior. So assume that the data of the environment is only limited amount that is relevant for what for the current behavior. You might have the brain construct internal models. So you can think of it this idea of modularity, and this idea of divide and conquer, a very complex problem, you divide it into smaller ones, and with that you may actually resolve the whole thing. And so this can then merge pretty well with hierarchical reinforcement learning. But I think really when I think of humans and other animals, some of the aspects that really strikes me as in a way powerful tools to accelerate learning or to make learning or problems more tractable are higher cognitive functions. So here I list a few of them, and I'm particularly interested in metacognition. And the idea is that all these different higher cognitive functions can really interact with reinforcement learning, and they would do so through like a host of like parallel loops linking different brain areas that are related to each or to multiple of these cognitive functions with the nuclei that are related to reinforcement learning computations in the brain. And so really this pairing, this coupling of these two, this tension between these two might be a computational solution and an architecture to learn efficiently that enables efficient learning. Now, in terms of actual experiments, I think the work that I've done and my colleagues have done at ATR brings really, I think, a sort of a very good example of this kind of situation that the brain faces of having to learn from a limited number of samples, but in a situation that is extremely complex. So if you think of decoded neurofeedback, so it's a brand of real-time fMRI, so functional magnetic resonance imaging that is coupled with online machine learning decoders to extract some patterns of activity and provide a reward to participants based on that. So what happens is that we measure the brain activity with the fMRI scanner in real time. The decoder analyzes those patterns and computes a likelihood that this pattern resembles our target function or our target pattern. And so we show the participant a feedback, so a visual cue on the screen that tells them how much money they would earn on that trial, but that effectively reflects what kind of information, what pattern they are currently activating. Now, usually in this kind of experiments, participants do not know the link between the activity and how this feedback signal is computed. So they're just instructed that they should, it's a game, and that they should learn or try to focus on their mind, to manipulate the activity of the brain, to earn as much reward as possible. But what we do, in fact, is we couple the reward with the likelihood of the decoder. Now, why am I saying all this? The reason is because I believe that this kind of problem is exactly what the brain, what I was trying to say before, the kind of situation that the brain faces in which you have a limited number of trials. Participants do maybe 100 or 200 or maybe 300 or 400, but not more than that, trials. So these are all each sample of experience, but in which the dimensionality of the problem is in a way is extremely high. Because if you think about it, here we're using fMRI, we have voxels, so they don't even correspond to actual neural activity. We are basing this on a restricted area of the brain rather than the whole brain. And so the brain itself has to, for it to happen, for learning to happen, would have to pair, to learn to associate this reward, this feedback term with these activity patterns at the neural level. And so this is really, it means that the brain in a way must be able to shrink these very high dimensions to something amenable. And this kind of experiment, this kind of decoded neurofeedback approach does work. So we see that humans, so we see changes in behavior, meaning that there must have been some form of plasticity happening in the brain. So for example, in the first study, by Kazu Shibata back in almost is already a decade ago, where they showed that with this approach you can modify behavior in the sense that we can induce perceptual learning without ever showing the stimulus itself. So perceptual learning is incepted simply by modulating the brain activity that is related to a target visual stimulus. In my own work, I have shown that we can use this technique to modulate metacognition, so especially confidence judgments. And so overall, this really tells me, so brings me to a question: how can the brain learn sort of neural dimensional space for optimal choices? This is because in this kind of setting, the brain has to pair a pattern of activity with a feedback term. And so really it has to find what is this pattern of activity. And if we look at the behavioral results of this experiment, it seems that the brain is able to do this. So we might then go on and ask whether the brain can, and if so, how, whether it can find this low dimensional space, but actually use it for choices. So in the previous example, it's just a kind of a simple association, but we can actually try to see if the brain is able to use these neural spaces for optimal choices. And so if this is true, if this is able, does metacognition facilitate learning? This really is stemming from the hypothesis that I think that metacognition is part of this machinery that is reducing the dimensionality of the problems. So probably all of you know this better than me, but just to really have a quick recap on what is metacognition, is essentially a self-monitoring function. So you can think of cognition about cognition, thinking about our own thoughts or our own decisions. So really as a kind of monitoring, internal monitoring function. And when we look at it from the perspective of consciousness, metacognition, I would say, it can be related to meta representations, because you have this. So you might have first order perceptual sensory representations, and then you might have a second order or somewhere higher up in this hierarchy of neural processing, what I would call a meta representation. So a representation, a re-representation, that then could be really useful for behavior. And we know that metacognition, really from a behavioral computational point of view, does guide behavior. So it can really help to change or to make even better future choices. Now here there is a kind of a tension between metacognition, consciousness, and non-conscious processes in the brain. And so here we thought about a new experiment. So a setup in which we have the brain. So if you think of the brain, you might have really billions, millions or billions of neural activity patterns. You may focus on a given area or all over the brain, but depending on how you sample this brain, you might have really almost endless number of those activity patterns. But here is I think is the nice idea of using machine learning decoders, is that those decoders, no matter how many activity patterns you may have, if you set a objective function to classify, let's say, two different conditions, these decoders will find a boundary, essentially. So a kind of partition or a split that will classify any pattern of activity into either one of the two classes. So basically, once we have built this kind of decoders from activity patterns in the brain, so once we learn this threshold or this boundary between the two conditions, then we can take any new activity pattern and essentially classify it into one of the two classes. And this actually gives us a very nice starting point for an experiment about non-conscious learning, but in a situation in which we don't, so the non-conscious aspect is not about some, let's say, some visual stimulus that we present and we mask, but really from the point of view of the brain itself. So we can use brain activity patterns to define what is the task, what are the task conditions. So in this task, we build this decoder to classify motion direction. So left or right motion direction from a cloud of dots, moving dots on the screen. Participants viewed those screens, viewed those dots on the screen. We acquired the fMRI data, and then we built those decoders. For half of our group, we use a decoder in the visual cortex, and for the other half, we use a decoder in the prefrontal cortex. We might expect to see some difference between these two, because the dorsolateral, the prefrontal cortex is involved in these metacognitive processes, while the visual cortex should be more about the objective kind of nature of the stimuli. And so once we build those decoders, that's fine. We call our participants back and we show them very dim, very ambiguous stimuli, and we ask them to judge whether the motion that they think they see is left or right. We then ask them to rate their confidence on their choices on a scale from 1 to 4, so from just guessing to very confident. And then we ask them, and this is I think the important bit, we ask them to bet on one of two options, option A or option B. If they bet on the right option, they would get a reward. If they bet on the wrong option, they would get just an error signal. And so participants have to learn on which sort of trial, or the brain has to learn under which circumstances the option A is optimal, so will lead to reward, and under which condition choice option B will lead to a reward. The experiment was done over 3 sessions. Here, this was the case for the first 2 sessions, in which the screen and the physical stimulus was just noise. So there is actually no physical information at all. There is no coherent motion. Now we'll explain to you just after why. On the 3rd session now, we actually showed coherent motion on the screen, starting from the beginning of the session with extremely low coherence, very dim stimuli, which gradually increased over the session to reach very strong stimuli towards the end. Now, why these 2 differences? And the reason is because by using these machine learning decoders during the time of the task in which participants actually, not even when they see, just before they see this noise stimulus, we measure the brain activity sort of in an intertrial interval, and we can use the decoder output to define this sort of this hidden state for the task. So whether the optimal option is A or B depends on what is the output of the decoder. If on this trial the output gives a higher likelihood for, let's say, a representation of right motion, then the optimal option is to choose A. If the decoder says left, then the best option is B. Now, participants have no clue about this pairing. We don't tell them. The stimulus itself on the first 2 sessions is just noise. So this really all depends on what is the activity in the brain and what the decoder tells us about this activity. So you can see it as a sort of clear translation of this scenario in which you have the brain. It has a very complex, very high dimensional problem, because the brain does not know which decoder we use, does not know which area we use, which time point. And so it has to pair neural activity with outcomes and actually to trigger an action, choose one of the 2 options. And all this, if it happens, should happen non-consciously, at least admittedly. So what we see is that when we look at the probability of choosing the optimal action, on the first session, we see that some participants might be already pretty high, but overall at the group level, participants don't seem to be able to make this choice above chance. So they don't select those two options better than chance, given the underlying non-conscious neural representation. But already from the 2nd session, which is in terms of the experiment itself is identical to the first session, now we start to see that overall participants start to become better. And so this sort of means that, although this is a small effect, this means that the brain is able to pair these neural activity patterns to an output, to an action, in order to get rewards. When we look at the third session, which here acts as a kind of control to see if participants can also, at the end, explicitly learn the task from a conscious perspective, now we see that once they learn to consciously associate the state with the action, so for example, it would be right motion with A action, or left motion with B action, their performance gets pretty high. They learn this towards the end of the session, actually. For one, this is because at the beginning, the stimulus is still extremely noisy. So there's a lot of ambiguity in the stimulus itself. And later on, it still takes some time before they can explicitly say what is the pairing. What is really interesting is that we see when we ask them at the end of the experiment, at what point in time they clearly knew explicitly, consciously, what was the association, their performance at that time was already way higher than chance. So really the unconscious part really goes on, and then it seems that then they become, at least with this kind of setup, then they become conscious about their policy. Also because the stimulus gets easier to see. But let's go to metacognition, which I think is the actual most interesting result here. So we can compute meta D prime, so an index of metacognitive ability, from what I call here session 0. This is the data from the session, an initial session that we use to construct the decoder, to train the decoder in the first place, in which participants also had to judge the direction of motion and give a confidence rating. So when we compute meta D prime on this data, which is independent from those 3 sessions, and we plot it against their baseline ability in those 2 learning sessions, where it's completely non-conscious learning, now we see that we have that this initial metacognitive ability can predict their later learning ability. So kind of indicates already a first tenuous link between metacognition and sort of reinforcement learning. So what we saw then is, okay, let's try to show this link a little bit more explicitly with some modeling, and we used a standard reinforcement learning model. If you want, I can tell you more at the end if you're interested. But it's basically a model-free approach, Q-learning. And what we did is that with this kind of reinforcement learning algorithm, we can compute the trial-by-trial prediction error. So reward prediction error, which is the mismatch between the expectation in terms of a reward of the value for that action and that state, and what is actually obtained. So the bigger the prediction error, one could say, the more the surprise. Now, prediction error is assigned because you can have a low expectation and get a reward, so you have a positive prediction error, or you can have high expectation, get no reward, and so you would have a negative prediction error. If we take the absolute value, the unsigned prediction error, here we get basically a magnitude of an index of the uncertainty in the learning. And then we can actually look at how it compares to the confidence ratings that participants gave on a trial-by-trial basis. So we get this magnitude of prediction error, trial by trial, and we get the different confidence rating trial by trial. And what we see, it's already from the first session. So this is, of course, is not significant, but one can appear to see a clear trend that when a participant is not confident in the choice, those are also the trials in which the prediction error is the biggest. So when there's the most essentially unexpected outcome. And with higher confidence, this seems to decrease. On the second session, this association between the uncertainty in learning and the confidence becomes stronger. So now we have this significant association. And when we look at on the third session, which now when participants explicitly learn and we can see also that the performance in learning is much higher, we see again that this effect really gets much stronger. So we have a neat progression of this association between metacognition and reinforcement learning measures throughout learning, and that really increases with learning. So finally, we thought, okay, here we have, this is nice. We see it behaviorally, we see it at the computational level, but ideally we would like to see also neural correlate or neural substrate of this coupling between the two, this psychological construct of confidence and this computational process in reinforcement learning. So what we thought is, okay, let's look at the activity patterns, so the multivoxel activity patterns in the DLPFC, which in the past have been associated with confidence. And we look also at the activity patterns in the basal ganglia, which we well know that's where reinforcement learning processes harbored and prediction error signals, general prediction error signals are found. So what we did is that we built a decoder for low and high magnitude of prediction error and low and high confidence. And then we look at the output of those decoders for each session, and we look at how at their independence. Here by independence, I mean, because we see this relation, if the two, this means that with low confidence, we have high magnitude of prediction error, and with high confidence, we have lower magnitude of prediction error. So the two are not independent. There's a clear relation between the two. Now we can see if the decoders that are trained on activity patterns that resemble confidence in the DLPFC and activity patterns that resemble that are related to those prediction errors in the basal ganglia, whether those decoder outputs also become associated with learning. And we can see the exact same pattern that learning-driven changes in this neural coupling. So that on the first session, this is it's very weak, almost non-existent. On the second session, this becomes significantly present. And then from the third session, this is a very strong coupling. So to have a little interim summary, what I've shown you so far is that we were able to use non-conscious brain state to determine task conditions. And this presents really a complex, high-dimensional decision problem to the brain. And it appears that metacognition in the form of confidence is related to the reinforcement learning processes that allow the brain to resolve this kind of problem, this task. We see correlates at the behavioral, computational, and neural level. But yeah, so far, so this is one kind of side of the story in which we have looked at metacognition, the pairing between metacognition and reinforcement learning. And now someone might think, yes, but this is also interesting because there you have metacognition, which is supposed to be something that we are aware of, that we monitor our own thoughts. And here we have this pairing in the learning that happens when the learning seems completely non-conscious, because participants, when we ask them, they're not conscious about their brain states that we use with the decoder to determine the task conditions, and they're also not conscious about the actual association, the actual policy they should use, not until the end of the experiment. So now we can actually, in a different set of experiments, I thought to look at what is the role then really of using a conscious policy to determine abstractions. So here now we will look at how the brain can construct abstractions, and this is really from the standpoint of participants using explicit conscious policies to resolve the task. And again, looking at how this abstraction is related to reinforcement learning processes. So in this different task, you may think this compares to the previous one is much simpler in a way, because we presented participants with visual stimuli that look like this Pac-Man. As you can see, are made of 3 visual features. So you have color, you have the stripe orientation, and you have the side of the mouth. So the side of the mouth could be right or left, the color could be red or green, and the orientation could be horizontal or vertical. And so we asked participants to tell us whether these Pac-Mans, they preferred one fruit or the other. The way that the task was set is there were underlying latent rules that described this preference. So in every, so the experiment was divided in blocks, mini blocks. In every block, there were only 2 of those features that were relevant. So in this block, for example, would be color and orientation. In this block would be the side of the mouth and the color. And how this pairing of features relate to the preferred fruit. And so participants, they have to learn to infer given the stimuli they see, the choices they take, and whether they get the feedback they receive, whether they are, whether this Pac-Man, for example, red or horizontal, prefers an orange or a gray one. The experiment was designed in a way that a block would end when participants did a strike of correct trials. So when we can see behaviorally that they have learned the association, then a new block would start with a new combination of features and new pairing features and fruits, so with different fruits. So this, we can really test over time if participants are able to learn this association, what kind of strategies they use, and at the computational level, we can look at whether they are trying to use all possible features or if they're able to do some kind of abstraction on the task and focus on the subset of relevant features. So the simple behavioral level, we just first want to see, okay, yes, they do learn the task, they're able to perform well this task. You can see this is trials, but across all blocks, so no distinction of blocks. You have the first trial, of course, is a chance, because on the very first trial of a new block, a participant has no idea what is the association. But we can already see that from the second, third, and later trials, the ratio corrects, so the probability of choosing the correct fruit, given the stimulus, gets higher and higher. What is also interesting, particularly, is that when we look at the learning across the experiment horizon, so in this left part is like within a block, so it's really block by block. But when we look at the learning speed, is essentially how quickly they could compute, they could learn the rule in a given block. The faster the speed, the less trial it took a participant to complete the block. The lower, of course, the opposite. We can see that over the horizon of the experiment, participants seem to become better. So this kind of suggests that maybe over time, they are learning a strategy to solve the task, or they are changing their strategy in learning these fruit preferences, these associations. We also collected confidence data. This is one of the limitations, is that this confidence data was collected at the very end of the experiment, but just asking overall participants how well they thought they performed in the task. And we can see this sort of expected, but a very nice association between the participants who were more confident were also the participants who were able to learn the blocks quicker. So they had either learning speed in terms of learning the rules on each block. But as I was mentioning, there's one underlying kind of aspect here, is that we have probably different behavioral strategies. And so we can use a simple, again, very simple computational approach with reinforcement learning to kind of disentangle what strategy participants might be using at any timing part or any block. And this is because, so in this simple reinforcement learning Q learning equation, we have this value function that takes a state and an action. So the state in our task is essentially the combination of features, and the action is the fruit that the participant selected. But the way that we designed the task was by having these three different features, but only having two of them that are relevant in any block. This allows basically this sort of task space to be represented with two different learning algorithms. So here in the left part, you see what I call a feature RL, feature reinforcement learning, which takes 8 explicit states. So the states here is defined by the features that were presented to the participant on that trial. This is because on every trial, the participant will always see the three trials, the three features. And so this makes our state up. This kind of algorithm is probably not very efficient because some of the states are redundant. If the two relevant features are only the orientation and the side of the mouth, those two states here are identical basically. They differ in the color, but the color is irrelevant maybe for this rule. So a more efficient, a better way is to extract these latent states which are based only on the relevant relevant features. And here, what I call abstract reinforcement learning, abstract RL. And so here we can now look. We can just use different states to model the behavior, either based on this approach or on this approach, and then we can see which one explains better participants' behavior. And so we can really maybe arbitrate on the strategy that they were using. From a very simple modeling point of view, it's just good to see that it is really expected, but to see that the abstract RL shows overall higher learning speed. This is really expected because it has the space to explore is smaller, and the model itself is an oracle, so it always takes the correct states. But what is particularly encouraging to see is that when we look at the participant data, each dot is one participant, we see that the abstraction index that we can compute from the modeling, basically, on how much a participant was prone to use the abstract RL versus the feature RL. So higher index means that they were more likely to use an abstract RL strategy. We can see that this also pairs nicely with the overall learning speed. So those who were better, they were more likely to use abstraction. There were also those that displayed higher learning speed. Now, when we look at the confidence, which is, I think this is again like the particularly interesting result, because it goes back to the idea, or to the hypothesis, that this confidence really is related to the to sort of more efficient reinforcement learning, one way or the other, either causally or just as a correlated function. But still, we see that again, those participants who had who were more confident in the overall performance were also those that had higher abstraction level. Sorry, I just noticed that here the abstraction level here is between 0 and 1, and before it was 1 and 2, but it's exactly the same measure. Again, as I said, because we can use these two models in parallel, we can really look at the behavior and classify the behavior. And so here you can see that every single dot in this plot is one block for one participant. What this plot shows here is that we have across all participants, they seem to use both learning strategies. So on some block, participants will use an abstract strategy, and on some blocks, they will be more likely to use a feature-driven strategy. So really trying to remember all possible combinations of features without focusing on the relevant one. As you can see here from this color bar, this appears strongly linked to the overall learning speed. As I was showing in the model simulation, our abstract RL is faster, as expected, because it has less space to explore. So it is natural to see also that when participants are learning quick, they're also more likely to have used an abstract strategy. Now we can see this to look a little bit more into it, like across the whole time point of the experiment, because one fundamental hypothesis here is that at the beginning, participants should be more likely to use a feature RL, and at the end, they should be more likely to use an abstract RL, because we have seen that over time, they tend to learn faster, to complete the blocks faster, to show higher learning speed. And this is exactly what we see. On the very first block, participants have, most of the participants use a feature RL strategy, while on the last block, there's more participants that use an abstract RL strategy. If we just do a median split over the whole block of the session, for each participant, we can see that early on, they are less likely to use abstraction, and later on, they're more likely to use abstraction. So this is a nice kind of viewpoint, in the sense that we can clearly see that participants seem to switch the strategy. And if they switch their strategy, now we might want to know what happens in the brain when participants are viewing the stimulus, so before the decision. Because participants are supposed to sort of construct these abstractions. So the brain has to be able to select the relevant features and then construct the task state so that learning can happen on those states and not just on all the features. So first of all, because it is a reinforcement learning task based on rewards, we might want to look at we have this model, so we might want to look simply at the value. Now the idea, why would we want to look at the value? The reason is because value might provide a very powerful proxy for the brain to select the relevant dimensions, to select the relevant features that then can be used to construct those latent abstract task states. And so if you run a simple model-based value analysis correlate across the whole brain, we see that there is this area in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex that appears strongly related to this value signal. Now, it's important for me to stress here that this value signal used in this analysis is computed with the best fitting algorithm on every trial, every block. So it's a value that can come either from the feature RL or from the abstract, whichever was best at explaining the behavior. Now we see this nice VMPFC value signal, but because of this signal here, now we might think, well, the brain has to construct this value signal from the visual information, because this is what participants are viewing at that time point. So the MPFC activity encodes value, but this prediction must be based on a task visual information. And so we run a PPI analysis, psychophysiological interaction analysis, using as a seed this exact VMPFC cluster that codes value. And we look for correlates across the whole brain. So we look for areas in the brain that under seeing the stimulus might be differentially sort of coupled with the VMPFC on high value or low value trials. So based on the value, on the expected value in any given trial. And we see that the only regions that seem relatively strongly coupled with the VMPFC, these are the visual cortex. So exactly the areas that are supposed to encode the visual information of the features relevant, the relevant or irrelevant, but the features in the task. We also see that the strength of this coupling is predictive of the learning speed. So the more the participants who had the stronger coupling between the VMPFC and visual cortex in high value situations, there were also those that overall were better at learning the task. So they were better at implementing the internal learning algorithm. And this, I think, provides again like good support for the idea that there is a clear neural basis for these learning abilities. But as I mentioned earlier, it seems that participants do use both type of strategies. They use both an abstract strategy and they use a feature strategy. So these, from a sort of computational point of view, are quite different in the sense that they use different type of states. They use different type of information from the visual stimuli. And so now we were interested in looking in terms of the brain, if there is any difference in using those two strategies. So on trials in which participants use a abstract strategy, or on trials where they use a feature strategy, is there anything different going on in the brain? We specifically were interested in the VMPFC for obvious reason, as I just showed you this previous result on value and the coupling with visual cortex, but also on the hippocampus, because it has been strongly associated with this sort of conceptual learning and abstraction and sort of feature representations when there is a goal. So we focused our analysis on those two regions of interest, and we basically extracted the overall activity in those areas in response to, at the time of viewing the stimulus, differentially for when participants use a feature strategy or an abstract strategy. And what we see is that only the VMPFC appears to have a modulation that depends on the strategy used, saying that the VMPFC appears prioritized or appears to be more involved when participants are using an abstract RL strategy rather than a feature RL. The hippocampus is rather agnostic, and this in a way makes sense because in both cases there is learning involved. In both cases there is some kind of you could say conceptual learning, but given also our hypothesis that sort of value and abstraction should be tightly linked, it also makes sense to see this this kind of result is what we would have expected. So here to summarize a bit this point, we have that abstraction correlates with the learning speed. And importantly, there is a neural correlate of this, which is the coupling between VMPFC and the visual cortex that clearly predicts this learning speed. This is in line also with previous work showing that value can affect kind of control the processing of sensory information and bias the processing of sensory information. We see that VMPFC activity, so the VMPFC is prioritized under abstraction. This might be related to the work by Nico Schuck and colleagues on the VMPFC and the overall orbitofrontal cortex representing hidden task states, because those abstractions in a way are hidden because the visual information in itself, all information for the abstraction is there, but one has to disentangle what is relevant and irrelevant. So in a way, I see it as tightly linked. And finally, it might be that value biases attention towards certain features for abstraction. So we could have an actual downstream effect of value to actually bias those to kind of streamline the selection of the relevant dimensions, relevant features. This is particularly based on recent work. This study here was based in rodents, where they found that lateral OFC neurons instruct sensory cortex through value or prediction error mechanism. So we might the mechanisms in our task here might be very similar. So we might also have an effect of value in generating, or at least in participating in generation of abstractions. But so far we only have correlational sort of findings. So one way to do this would be to artificially add value to a feature. Now, artificially adding value to a feature, we could do this again with masking or with some task kind of effect, but it would not be as clean of an approach as I think as using neural reinforcement or decoded neurofeedback, where we can pair the neural representation of a specific feature in the task, for example, color, with rewards. So with training, this would mean that we are effectively really synthetically tagging a neural representation of a feature with value, with reward. As I mentioned earlier in the talk, I might really briefly go over it again to refresh your minds. How does decoded neurofeedback works is that we have participants in the scanner. We use a machine learning decoder that takes as input the current activity pattern from the participant and processes it to compute a likelihood that it corresponds to a target state or a target pattern. So in our case, in our experiment here in this manipulation, our target, for example, is color. We would say red color. So what we do is that we give a larger reward when this representation is more likely to represent to be our target feature. So participants are not instructed about this, so it is all implicit. And we have, and the only thing again that they are told, they're instructed, is they have to maximize their gains. They have to earn as many rewards as possible. So by modulating their activity. What we do is that we base this reward signal on their current neural activity. And so after 2 days of this training, participants did again the same task, the same behavioral task, in which they had to learn the fruit preference of this visual stimuli made of 3 different features, with only 2 of them relevant and 1 irrelevant. So now what is nice here is that we would have some blocks. For example, if we have trained for color, we would have some blocks in which the trained or the tagged, the primed feature is relevant, And we would have maybe other blocks in which, for example, you would have orientation and the side of the mouth, this symbol here. They are both relevant, but the color is irrelevant. So now we can compare the blocks in which the value target feature is relevant or irrelevant, and we might expect different results. So of course, we might expect that in the case of when the feature is relevant, learning should be faster and abstraction should be higher, per our hypothesis. In the case of the irrelevant, this is a little bit more tricky because we could think that the effect is asymmetric, so it just doesn't affect it. So when the other feature is irrelevant, it might just be not considered as would normally happen. But when the feature is relevant, it is much more considered. Or we might expect a sort of pullback effect in which when the feature is irrelevant, this might sort of slow down learning. So here we will compare the abstraction level that participants attained at the end. So in the latter half, in the second half of the initial main experiment. And so for each participant, we have an overall abstraction level. And we compare this with the abstraction level that we can measure with the same modeling approach in the two conditions, relevant or irrelevant. Now we see that after the value tagging of the feature at the neural level, we have abstraction is drastically increased when the feature is relevant, but it remains the same, or if anything, is actually decreased when it is irrelevant. So this really to wrap again all these results, what does it tell us? So first of all, we find that abstraction correlates with learning speed. This is sort of also should be the case because it is by design in the task that to learn better, the agent is bound to use abstractions. If abstractions are not used, we should not see improvement in learning speed. We find that the coupling between the VMPFC and the visual cortex predicts learning speed. So here maybe the question, the follow-up question would be, are these task states continuously recreated in the brain to account for new information? So in this kind of task, in some situations, maybe it's not really, you might think it is not so efficient to continuously re-represent task states because maybe the task is not changing that much. But if we think about it in a more ecological viewpoint, or in the real world in which information in general tends to change quite often and to be noisy and stochastic, unpredictable, then it makes sense to have this coupling between sensory areas, value coding, and abstraction areas that is kind of ongoing and really can re-represent the same task states over and over. We see that the VMPFC area is responsible for value construction. It's prioritized under abstraction. And value may bias attention towards features to be integrated for abstraction. This is our neurofeedback experiment points in the direction, because when we add value artificially to a feature, we see that this feature is, or abstraction is more likely to be used to learn the task. And finally, the value computed in the VMPFC is linked to abstraction. This again, maybe tagging sensory information, but there might be other mechanisms, for example, update task states. And I will discuss now some of those other ideas. So first of all, we have the value signals, what to abstract from the VMPFC. So in previous work by Nikoshuk and colleagues, they found that the VMPFC represents those hidden task states. So, and the area that they found in their study, the design was very different. But the area that they find here that is related to those hidden task states is strikingly similar. Sorry for not putting here on this slide, to our result of the value signal. And so it might really be that when value is used to construct those abstractions, really we have what the VMPFC is doing is recreating tasks, like hidden task states. those hidden task states can be coming from working memory, can be extracted from the visual information as a set of relevant features, regardless of the of the way that this information comes. The VMPFC would represent those hidden task states. And I think from a slightly different point of view, but very much related, there is this recent work by Etienne Coquelin and Domenal, where they looked at this idea of exploitation. So when the brain has to arbitrate and has to learn and has to decide when to use a current strategy or when to switch to a new behavioral strategy. So what I found is that the VMPFC tracks the reliability of the current strategy. So you might have a sort of certainty or uncertainty signal that could be related to our signal that we find in terms of value. So if you have a high value, the information is very reliable, therefore is used for abstraction. If you have low value, it might be not really reliable. But particularly what they found is that the DMPFC instead, so more dorsal part of the brain, signal when, given the available information coming from the VMPFC, it would signal when to stay or to switch in the strategy. You could think of it as a kind of as a controller. Given the available information, would decide what course of action to take. And here, how does metacognition, I think, to come back to it, comes into play, is that this is my current working hypothesis, and really also in terms of ideas, work in progress, is that metacognition may be part of this cognitive controller for behavioral strategies. Again, there's this recent work in monkeys, in which the animals had to do some kind of arbitration between the source of noise, of errors. And they found that the anterior cingulate cortex controlled when the monkey should switch. And we also know that in humans, the ACC is really related again to metacognition, to confidence as a certainty, as a probability of making a correct judgment or correct response. So I really think that overall we have confidence, and metacognition do play a prominent role in reinforcement learning. If we look at the literature, there are actually several studies that point at confidence acting on different aspects of the reinforcement learning process, the reinforcement learning loop, from gating sensory information, from acting on the encoding of the states for the learning algorithm, on controlling the the stochasticity of the way the agent takes their action, as well as acting on the learning rate or on how prediction errors are integrated for further updates and learning. So really see this kind of hierarchical metacognitive controller. And I think the most to me the most speculative kind of part of it is that metacognition, and in a way by extension also consciousness, one of their clear roles that they have in terms of adaptive behavior could be to generate those meta representations. So in the brain, to have maybe in prefrontal cortex or those areas, to have these meta representations that are derived from sensory information, from memory streams, and to create those very low dimensional task spaces or behavioral trajectories such that behavioral learning can be efficient. And so with that, I would like to thank you all for your attention. It's been already, I think, 1 hour of talking, and collaborators without whom all this work would have not seen the light. And of course, funding agencies as well for their support. Thank you.